In the past month, I have made a lot of videos regarding old Haitham, as I've analyzed him from a theory crafting perspective in several ways. Now that the livestream has finally dropped, and the skate has been made more or less official, it's time for me to release a full pre-release video guide about him, where I go through his skate, artifacts, weapons, constellations and themes, while providing thoughts on how good I think he will be. Let's get straight into it. First things first, old Haitham is a carry-style character, whose field time is similar to on-field damage dealers such as Hu Tao or Raiden. His damage output can reach significant heights if you decide to maximize it, but his on-field dendro application is also quite valuable and makes him good even in roles where his damage output isn't necessarily the main focus for the team. Now, let's see what his kit is about. Old Haitham is a peculiar character, as he specializes in elemental skill damage, but makes use of the entirety of his kit in a meaningful way to maximize his potential. In fact, the true main source of his damage is the sizzle light mirrors he can create through his elemental skill, burst and passive. Depending on how many mirrors he has up, those will deal higher damage in separate instances, up to 3 times, as that's the maximum amount of mirrors he can have at a given point. Having at least a mirror up will also provide old Haitham's normal, plunge and charge attacks a dendro infusion. The damage generated by the mirrors has high elemental mastery scaling, both in terms of multipliers and in terms of how his second passive can increase their damage through damage buffs. For this reason, just like Nahida, old Haitham is a character that should predominantly be built with elemental mastery. A mirror stack will elapse every 4 seconds, and the hits will be generated on a cooldown of 1.6 seconds when it hits opponents with normal or charge attack, so each mirror will generate an average of 3 hits before it goes away. Overall, in standard rotations, his mirrors will account for 60 to 70% of his personal damage, so it will be very important for you to raise old Haitham's elemental skill talent first. Still, note that spread procs are a considerable chunk of the mirror's damage, and since that won't scale up with talent level investment, old Haitham won't rely on that as much as other carries do. In terms of damage generated, both his elemental burst and his normal and charge attacks are minimal in terms of relevance. Starting from his burst, it's a multi-hit dendro attack which consumes all of old Haitham's mirrors on cast, and deals an amount of hits which increases depending on how many mirrors got consumed, and then creates a quantity of mirrors that varies on how many mirrors got consumed previously. Generally, the more mirrors it consumes, the fewer it will create, and vice versa. Since his burst damage pales in comparison to the damage his mirrors can dish out, it's almost always best to use it in a way it maximizes the mirror's uptime. In fact, despite it not being a significant part of old Haitham's kit damage-wise, the burst comes with a hefty 70 energy cost, and the reason is that its usage is essential to ensure old Haitham will have 3 mirrors up for most of his rotation. For this reason, using his burst at 0 stacks should be a popular option. With that in mind, his burst will account for 10% of his damage output in most cases, which becomes 7.5% if you take its spread proc away, making leveling up the burst talent quite insignificant for old Haitham. Likewise, while his normal attacks can account for up to 30% of his rotation damage, half of that comes from the spread procs they generate, which makes leveling up their talents quite inefficient cost-wise. In my opinion, you should definitely max old Haitham's elemental skill talent, but leaving his burst and auto attacks talents at level 6, 7 or 8 will be more than fine. Now, since I've mentioned things like mirrors management for old Haitham, let's look into his rotations to analyze how he should be played on most teams. As a reminder, he has 3 ways to generate mirrors, namely his elemental skill, which generates 1 or 2 on cast, his passive, which will let one of his charge attack generate 1 per rotation, and his elemental burst, which can generate up to 3. From what I've experimented, to keep 3 mirrors up for around 12 seconds, which should be old Haitham's field uptime length on average, it's basically essential for you to use his elemental burst at the start of his rotation, as that will allow him to create 3 mirrors right off the bat, and then use his skill and charge attack at intervals of 4 seconds each to reapply a mirror stack as soon as one goes out. As long as you do that, there is very small difference between different auto attacks combos, since their raw damage is quite low as I've explained earlier. Generally, try not to use his full string, but stop at the 3rd or 4th normal attack, as that's more efficient in terms of duration of his attacks. Basically, normal attacks up to 3 and then cancel, or normal attacks up to 2 or 3 and then charge attack, are both fine choices. When it comes to artifact options, old Haitham is a rather straightforward character. Since his damage scales heavily on elemental mastery, if you're running a composition where old Haitham's personal damage output is the main focus for the team, and somebody else is already holding the Deepwood set to apply Dendro resistance reduction on opponents, then the Gilded Dream artifact set is the clear-cut best option for him, with mixed options such as Dendro damage plus EM sets, or double EM, being inferior alternatives that you should only consider if you have better substats on them than on your Gilded Dream set. Alternatively, if there is no one on the team who can make good use of the Deepwood set, then it surpasses all other options for old Haitham. This is also the case on teams like Hyperbloom or Burgeon, where old Haitham's personal damage output isn't that important, and applying resistance reduction to increase the bloom damage of the team is crucial. In terms of artifact stats, Elemental Mastery, Dendro damage and crit is the combination you should have on your Sands, Goblet and Circlet. For substats, you should mainly focus on energy recharge until you get an appropriate amount, then crit, then Elemental Mastery. Attack rolls aren't completely worthless, but they're just always straight up worse than EM ones. I'll go more in depth on how much energy recharge he needs in the team building section of the video. Regarding his weapon choices, old Haitham benefits from a wide array of good 5-star options that can prove to be very good alternatives to his clear best weapon, his signature, Light of Foilar. In fact, weapons like Missplitter, Heron, and Jade Cutter are just around 10% worse than his signature weapon in single target, and in AoE situations this gap should become smaller, since part of Foilar's potential comes from the elemental mastery scaling hits its passive provides, which count as multiple separate hits in AoE situations, meaning it works like Yunjin and Shenhe buffs, and it will just scale worse than other options even against just 2 enemies. As for his best cheap options, Shigure is a great boss killer, but scales badly in AoE just like Foilar due to its single target locked passive. Harbinger of Dawn is a high risk, high reward option, and Iron Sting or Black Sword are nice for their consistency, although they're significantly worse than the best options. Anything worse than Refinement 5 Iron Sting should be considered mediocre or bad. Still, depending on the team you use old Haitham on, his weapon might not matter as much as you think, as spread teams are the only ones where his personal damage contribution for the team is really significant, so upgrading a mediocre weapon for a very strong weapon there could make a significant difference. Alternatively, on something like Quickbloom or even something like Hyperbloom, his personal damage output becomes much less important, so his viability won't depend on his weapon there. As a whole, you shouldn't pull for his signature weapon if you have a strong 5-star option, or if you plan to use him on any team that isn't spread, since in that case the benefit it will provide just won't be worth its price. Moreover, I've made a detailed video on what's more worth for your money between his constellations and signature weapon, and the answer was that despite his signature not being particularly strong if compared to other options, his constellations aren't that great either. To summarize, his constellations are a 70% damage increase in total for him, with his C2, C4 and C6 being the only meaningful damage increases, and his C1 being potentially useful, but probably rather niche. He's definitely below average in terms of how much his constellations increase his damage, and while it's not easy to establish constellations value in pre-release, since speedrun potential, for example, is something that should be tested in practice, I don't expect Haitham to be especially good at that. Regarding his team options, as a Dendro sustained damage dealer who has consistent Dendro infusion, he can basically be used on every type of Dendro team. I've made a lot of videos on his specific team synergies, so you'll probably find more detailed info there. To summarize everything I said in the past, the first thing you should know is that, for teams where his damage output is valuable, you should always use him alongside a second Dendro unit, since his ER requirements in solo Dendro are just stratospherically high. Nahida is his best partner, since she can battery him while providing a meaningful damage increase through her EM buff, and while also generating more off-field Dendro damage than other Dendro options. Dendro main character, Collie, and especially Yao Yao can be fine alternatives, but honestly, Haitham's team's damage just drops off a cliff without Nahida. Teams-wise, he fits nicely on spread compositions, and can be a decent replacement for Nahida on Hyperbloom, Burgeon or Nilo Hyperbloom as the on-field Dendro applicator for Bloom generation, but the team he truly excels on is Quickbloom. Quickbloom is the Dendro composition that mixes Quicken Uptime with Bloom generation to try to get the best of both worlds. For it to work, you need to replace a unit from a typical spread comp with an off-field Hydro applicator like Xincho, Yelan or Kokomi. In reality, compared to spread comps, some of Quicken's uptime gets sacrificed for Hyperbloom damage, but their combination makes for very strong team damage results at free-to-play level of investment. Depending on how much off-field Hydro application you have, your Quicken uptime might diminish or increase, but since those scenarios come with more or less Hyperblooms respectively, there should be a nice balance among all Quickbloom variants. Regarding spread teams, I've made a video to compare Haitham's potential on those teams to Tignari. The comparison is interesting because Tignari enables a quick swap playstyle for the team, and doesn't rely on a second Dendro unit, which allows you to maximize the potential of the Electro sub DPS on the team, while Haitham is definitely more geared towards a Quicken composition that focalizes on the Dendro unit's damage, since his long field time makes it tricky to properly utilize Electro sub DPS that perform best on Quickswap, and his reliance on a second Dendro unit definitely makes his team more static. In that sense, triple Dendro teams have potential moving forward, but as it currently stands, his spread teams should fall short if compared to Tignari's spread compositions, and other Quicken compositions with just one Dendro unit as well, since characters like Fischl and Yae performing greatly are the main thing that makes those types of team great. There is also some burst DPS potential for him on a spread team with Raiden, something I've analyzed properly in another video, but long story short, it's not particularly worth even over other Haitham spread teams, unless you have high investment on your Raiden, so something like Constellation 2. In general, his reliance on Nahida reaches its peak on spread teams, and I wouldn't recommend to pull for him if you plan to use him on a spread team without her, regardless of the level of investment you plan to have on him. For Bloom teams, Haitham should be a valuable option if you lack Nahida. In fact, Both in solo Dendro and double Dendro, he should perform nicely on those teams, since his on-field application potential is perfectly comparable to Nahida, as he has 3 different sources of Dendro up between his skill, burst and out attacks. On Nilo Bloom teams, a full EM build works nicely on him, since he will proc a portion of the team's bloom both on double Dendro and solo Dendro lineups. On these teams, you don't need to necessarily care about his ER too much, since using his burst every rotation shouldn't be a requirement to make him function properly. All in all, Haitham is rather flexible in terms of available teams, and just like it is for most Dendro compositions that are already in the game at the moment, you should expect great results even at free-to-play level of investment. In terms of value, Haitham should be a solid pull for most players. If you have Nahida, you can use them together to make a strong and reliable Quickbloom team, or a decent spread team. If you lack Nahida, that also means you lack a good on-field Dendro applicator for Hyperbloom, Burgeon and Bloom. So Haitham will fit a quite strong niche for your account in that case. Let me know your plans regarding him, and if you enjoyed the video, leave a thumbs up and subscribe. See you next time!